Let me focus on the first, on the energy transition question, because that's the question about central question about this session. And second, how does it connect with climate? Because that's another important issue. And then the what was asked from me was a little bit on what kind of energy financing is happening and what is the scale and what is the requirement, etc. So let me talk about the transition first. Energy transitions is this is not going to be the first energy. We are we have gone through two complete energy transitions in human history, in the short history of, if I'm going by the longer time frame, and both these times it was very different from this present energy transition we are talking about. In fact, first energy transition was about 11,000, starting 11,000 years ago, which led to massive population increase, not much increase in human quality of life and wealth or GDP, not much of that per capita GDP. The second energy transition that we start normally with is the fossil fuels, which increased, which actually released a large part of the world from the Malthusian economy, and also brought in huge increase in per capita income, wealth, per capita consumption of both energy and material. So when we are talking, and there are in between other smaller sectoral and other energy transitions, like the electricity transition is we started almost 130 years ago, or the transportation from horse to rail and afterwards roadways. So those kind of transitions are completely different from the transition that we are now talking about. The main reason is none of the earlier transitions had humanity facing a crisis. Throughout the transitions we have any transition that we have seen an opportunity, both an economic opportunity and a social developmental opportunity. Both are connected. But this time I think we are still looking at the transition and the challenge through the same lens of economic opportunity and development. And that's the first thing I urge everyone to discard, because this transition is demanded by a crisis, and that crisis is very apparent. I will not go into the details. Now, second, this crisis that has been talked about, just two more points that are important to understand, that there are a lot of discussions about how fast we should go, how fast we are going, should we moderate, should we think of all other options. It's very clear that these are, I'll come to this later and come to some simple figures afterwards, but these are considerations which are basically rooted in the today's mainstream capitalist economic thinking. If we think about, just think about the non-human ecosystem. There are something like 1.5 million species of life. The consequences of not acting fast enough, of changing either 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is a very, very progressive thing that we consider now, or 2 degrees Celsius, which is thought about. The 1.5 degrees Celsius is impossible, the target Paris Agreement, which talks about. Even 2 degrees seems to be almost going away. So these are possible. Human society can still adapt to that by adaptations which are not biological, which are cultural and technological. But you have to remember that all other species have no technological adaptation possibilities. It's only humans who have technological adaptation possibilities. We are completely altered or substantially altered ecosystem. For all other species of life, an completely altered or substantially altered ecosystem means disaster. And that's what we are already seeing. So this question of we can still go at the economic consideration pace and have a transition at our own pace, at our own economic logic, that completely negates the ecosystem approach, and that will cause a massive ecosystem devastation, which we know the IPBES report of 2018, most people probably have at least seen the headlines. That's up roughly around 1 million species out of 1.5 are facing extinction. So this is the kind of consideration that we are not really taking in when we are talking about the energy transition question. What are the responses from the global community of nations? Basically, the leaders of nations, the governments, and the business. If we look at, and I will also mention Paris Agreement, like the way Arti said, I have a very different view of Paris Agreement. If you look at the global climate negotiations, because of which this energy transition became imperative, if you look at it before 2009 or till early 2009 or mid 2009, the dominant discussion paradigm, the paradigm was the what is needed to be done dictated by science. Whether that was being done or not, that was not being done. That's another question. But the global agreement was that this is science dictating. This is what science dictates. This is what needs to be done. From starting from 2009 Copenhagen summit, and then Cancun summit in 2010, which concretized this, which ends in Paris Agreement, we have gone from a science dictated need to do paradigm of climate action and climate negotiation to pledge and review paradigm. The today's paradigm is what I will do, what I can do, or I not even can, what I would like to do, and this is my pledge. I need to pay 100 rupees, but I will pay 1 rupee. And now you review whether I have paid that 1 rupee. So we have actually degraded the global climate negotiation from a hardly need, but a very, very strongly needed science dictated need to do basis to pledge and review. Whatever I can do, I'll do. And that depends on many other factors, not the extinction of species, the devastation in climate system, the tipping point crossing. These are secondary or even tertiary consideration. So the other factor of global climate negotiations, particularly the governments and the business, because the negotiations, lot of movement groups, civil society also participate, and there are counter voices. But the dominant negotiation is governments, which are dominated by in their own countries and in their own voices by the mega corporations and the businesses, the capital. Their voices have also acted in masking the severity and the extent of the crisis, because they have continuously invented language which make it as a normal process of change rather than an urgency where you need to act, not because this will give an economic opportunity, but you need to prioritize safety of the human society and also sustainability of the biological ecosystem, the biological life system. So these are major negotiations. I'll not go into detail. Even though Paris Agreement, a lot of people are beating their drums, the Paris Agreement is a great thing. All reports have shown, even if the Paris Agreement pledges, because these are pledges, not commitments, are fully adhered to by 2100. And these are very conservative estimates that we can go into and see, because none of this consider the positive feedback effects of the climate system. So even if all the pledges are fulfilled, even then by conservative estimates, we'll exceed 3.2 degrees Celsius and go up to 5 degrees or a little more, 5.2. And global scientific consensus is 2 degrees Celsius is a Lakshman Rekha where the tipping points might be crossed in multiple climate systems. And we might even come to that earlier, which the last 3 months research reports that are coming up, if you look at this, you'll see that we are coming to that much before the IPCC predictions. But let me now go into the other factor, the urgency of this action, because the transition we have always, and I don't know whether we are more of an economic animal as human society or more of a political animal. This is a debate. We talk about political economy, but sometimes, like the farmers' struggle has very clearly shown, that politics sometimes wins. And politics, if you have to win, often it has to sort of override some of the economic considerations that the capitalist economy is presenting. So this transition is actually demanded at a much faster rate than what we are doing. And I disagree with anyone who, I don't think Sikumar disagrees with this, but I disagree with anyone who says that we are going at a fast pace for transition. We are actually going at a much, much lower pace than what would have been needed or what is right now needed. And there is an economic logic that is often given for this, that, okay, like this price parity between renewable energy and coal power, which became a parity was obtained in different countries at different times. 2014 to 2015 was talked about that solar energy, solar photovoltaics achieved price parity with coal power. So these are given as economic logic. Okay, now the transition action can take place. But if you look at actual assessments, the aggregate damage estimate studies that has been done, which shows that if you go to a 3 degrees Celsius world, which is from the pre-industrial to rather than a 2 degrees Celsius for delayed action, the aggregate damage estimate is roughly 1% of GDP, 0.95% of GDP, which was 2014-15. So it's more than 1% of GDP, rounding up to 1% of GDP. And the action, the cost of the litigation action, cost of the adaptation action is one time. For any one action, it's one time. For mitigation, if you're not doing mitigation or an adaptation, particularly mitigation, the cost is annual. It's a recurring cost. 1% of GDP at today's price will be $850 billion per year, roughly around 850, $85 trillion a year. So 8.5, sorry, $8.5 trillion dollars. Or sorry, little less than $1 trillion, $850 billion, which is much higher than today's entire investment in the power sector. Entire investment, not only renewable. That I will come to later. The second fallacy of this is if you go into action, when action is better in terms of even economic sense, because the aggregate damage estimate also makes economic sense. Because ultimately, what you are doing by not acting fast enough is only deferring that economic cost from our generation to the next generation. There is other studies and there are papers published in Nature and other journals, you can see, if we have acted in 1990, what we knew at that time to be needed actions, then the needed action for stabilizing the climate, global climate, then this transition would be part of that action, would have meant a 15% cost to the GDP at 2080, going 2080. If we start at 2020, as the Paris Agreement says, because Paris Agreement is going operative 2020, though it became actually effectively operated earlier, but Paris Agreement is supposed to become operative in all its aspects by 2020. So if we act 2020 onwards, that same cost becomes 18 to 19% by 2080. Instead of 2085, it becomes maximum at 2080, and it from 15%, it becomes 18%. So there is a very clear economic logic built in, genuine economic logic built in early action and early stronger action in mitigation. And that mitigation, energy transition, is not only mitigation. And as Sukumar rightly pointed out, that energy transition of the right kind can also mean a good adaptation action. So these kind of falls of the fallacy of economic logic that renewable energy was not price competitive earlier, which is false, because we have not taken the other cost, which we are deferring to the next generation or the generation even after that. The cost of ecosystem damages that we are not even now considering, because there are many estimates which say the global ecosystem services. I'm against the monetization of the ecology, but if you just calculate rough calculations, it's above the total GDP of the world today, the total ecosystem production values. It's 10% to 20% above, based on different kind of calculations. So if you see that we could have acted 20 years ago or even 30 years ago, and the technology, some of the technologies didn't exist, fine. Some of the technologies did exist. And these kind of actions, by not taking actions, we are actually going into a higher cost, which actually negates your economic argument. I'll quickly come into the kind of energy investment that has happened over the last several years, and I'll not go back in too much in history. If we look at the last 5 years of energy investment after Paris Agreement, because everyone say that Paris Agreement has given a huge boost. Actually, the Paris Agreement came to being because of two reasons. One, by that time, that economic logic for capitalist industry, the corporates, became very clear that by providing this solution, they can make good profit. The second was, as I said earlier, the come down or the climb down from a science dictated need to do climate paradigm to climate paradigm of pledge and review. Do as you like, or do as your convenience says. So these two actually dictated the Paris Agreement, because otherwise the French was not extra persuasive than the others to bring people together and to sign. If I am not required to do hard things, if I am required to do only what I will say I'll do, then there is no problem in agreeing to that and signing on to that. So that's what the Paris Agreement is. And as I've said, as lots of studies have clearly established, even the Paris Agreement pledges fully established, fully committed, fully implemented is not going to save the world from climate catastrophe. It's not going to keep us from actually going past the tipping point. Actually, now it is being shown even by the Indian government study, which was released in June 16, on June 16 this year, the climate change assessment over the Indian region, they are showing by 2060 to 2070 decade, maybe we'll cross the 2 degrees Celsius line. So those kind of uh, drum beating about the Paris Agreement should stop. This is not going to save us. This is not going to do much to actually help the people at the lower rung, and not to talk about who are not people, the 1.5 million other species. And to just to remember that those species are also our basis of living, because all these species, if half of them disappear, then probably we'll be in a much deeper shoot than going for coal and renewable energy kind of debate. So that's a much greater, because the insect population that is collapsing, insects are the basis of pollination of fruits and vegetables. So that kind of, I'm not going to details, that kind of considerations don't really appear in the economic considerations. But if we look into what kind of investments had gone into, if this is the crisis, if the urgency of the transition is this much, if, because that probably people don't accept, but if it is, it's an urgent action needed, transitioning away from carbon intensive infrastructure of energy to non-carbon. And here there are a lot of other issues, nuclear and others are much more debatable, though they call it non-carbon or zero carbon, they are not. Apart from that, there are other issues. I'm not going into that. But what kind of investments have happened? If you look at the investments globally, something like $1.8 trillion have been invested roughly from 2015, 16, 17, 18. 18, actually, the investment fell. From the 2016, 17, 15, 16, 17, to 2018, actual global investment in all the energy sectors fell from towards around 1.7 to 1.78 trillion dollars. But the if you look at, of course, I'm not considering the 2020 situation, because the pandemic has created major issues, and this year the present estimate by International Energy Agency is the global energy investment will be $1.5 trillion. Report released recently, the International IEA report. So the actual energy investment, though we need a fast and complete transition of our energy system, the actual energy investment over the last 3-4 years have actually declined, because the amount remaining same means in terms of real value, you are investing much less. And the fall in 2018, of course, the fall was faster in coal. 2019-20 fall was faster in oil, the fastest in oil. That's very clear, because if economic activities go down, then obviously your demand for energy will also go down. The money to buy energy has to be there. But what we look at, that even the earlier rise, which was there on solar PV and wind, is actually flattening out. The investment in solar PV and wind is almost flat. The solar PV investment has actually fallen by 1%. Wind investment is roughly flat, though the actual capacity addition has increased a little bit, because the cost of solar has fallen, solar PV particularly, and solar PV with storage is now coming up. And as Sukumar was rightly pointing out, today the European estimate is that solar PV with storage comes to around 6 euro cents, which will be roughly 5 rupees. So in Indian context, and that was in 2019 estimate. So this must have fallen even now. So this kind of possibilities, economic possibilities now, today we are starting in 2019 or 20. And in this framework, if we have to do a transition, what IPCC has said earlier, that 2030 is the time by which we must reduce our carbon emissions by 50%, and by 2050 to zero or net zero. I'm not going to zero and net zero debate. That kind of economic logic, as I pointed out, to begin with, it was flawed, because it was deferring our cost calculation, calculating the cost to the ecosystem, calculating the cost that our non-action or delayed action is increasing the cost for action for the next generation or the next 10 years. That economic, including the economic fallacy, this has actually caused massive economic cost overruns. And today's economic situation, where the global economy is in a depressed situation, it will be very hard to imagine that the global investment in renewable energy will jumpstart from the present level of like the out of the total investment of 1.8 trillion dollar in the all energy sectors, and in the power sector of roughly around 775 billion dollars, the renewable energy sector got around 273 billion. So if you look to the entire energy sector, it's how much? It's roughly uh, less than 20%. So that's not a very promising scene for an energy transition. If at this crisis scenario, at this juncture, we are investing just 20% of our entire energy investment, global energy investment in renewable energy, all kinds of renewable energy, then that's not going to do a transition which will help in the climate crisis. So that's one thing. I'll just quickly end by saying what it entails for India. It can entail two different kind of things. Uh, like Srikumar mentioned, the Kusum scheme, there are other ideas of similar access. The SDGs talks about universal access to affordable modern energy. So I'll not go into debates of SDGs whether even further development from this level, today's base level, is possible without further ecological degradation. That's another question. But one thing that has given us another clear thing, that has given a false sense of security. Even the IPCC reports have given us a false sense of security by focusing the entire debate on the carbon. We have forgotten that in the year 2019, the global ecological footprint is already 1.7 times the total available biocapacity of the Earth. The total available biocapacity of the Earth is around 12.2 billion global hectares, whereas, and that translates to roughly for around 7.8 billion people, that translates to around 1.65 global hectares per person. Whereas today, our global average, with all the differences between countries and within countries, our global average is 2.78. So we are already 70% above the Earth's entire global biocapacity for producing and recycling waste. It's not only the carbon, it's the entire ecological footprint, the entire biocapacity of the Earth that we have long time ago, we have exceeded. By August, we exceed. By 1st of August, we exceed. So what it entails for India, just a minute or a half, it can entail two things. One, if we really now go for a, which I don't think will happen, it's very unusual to happen with the present politics and present economics and the domination of present political economic thinking, it will not happen. But what could have happened is if we had gone ahead with a much more decentralized energy production, and which obviously details are, Sikumar has pointed out, grid connected so that it makes efficiency more, it balances out all this, even the bad seasons, etc. But if we had gone for that, it would have not only given the today's, we have to understand in the today's energy supply system, the rural, which is roughly 55 to 58%, the rural consumer and the rural economy is at the end of the line. What your energy production is, after meeting all the other needs, it goes into a long grid, and at the end of this, with a very thin grid, literally, it reaches the rural consumer. And sometime he or she or they get or do not get, and it's disrupted. It gets disrupted often. But if we had gone for a much more decentralized system, apart from all other things, apart from the democratic function of its democratic character of it, you could have put the rural consumer and the rural economy at the front end. That means a farmer or a group of farmers could have decided to save their crops by using a little bit of energy and not have to depend on a very unreliable supply at the end of a long chain where they might get or might get now, might not get after 1 hour. So that would have been a dramatic change. And today, with our rural economy stagnating or even degrading, that would have been a far greater contribution to a decentralized renewable energy system. And obviously, you can't have a decentralized nuclear energy system. You can't have a decentralized coal energy system. You can easily have, because of its modular character, because of its technological nature, you can have a decentralized renewable energy system. So, and those technologies are available. Even integrating those decentralized systems are very easily available, technologically possible, being done all the time. So that would have been a great contribution. That would have not only done an energy transition, that would have done an economic transition for India and similar other economies. Thank you.